Hi, and welcome to Blooming Resistance, where truth takes root and change begins to bloom. I'm Kate, and this is our very first episode, and I thought it fitting to start with the story that inspires our name. It's a story about courage, about the power of words, and what it means to resist, even when the cost is high. Today, we're talking about the White Rose, a small, student-led resistance group in Nazi Germany. Their actions were small, a few leaflets, a handful of friends, but their courage has echoed across generations. And before we dive into their story, let's ground ourselves in the present, because every seed of courage planted in the past still shapes what resistance looks like now. So this week, student protests have been erupting again. On campuses across the US, young people are walking out. They're organizing teach-ins. They're demanding justice for Gaza. Or calling attention to banned books and censorship this week. And what strikes me about this moment is how ordinary people are still willing to risk comfort, even safety, to speak the truth. And it reminds me so much of the White Rose, because resistance rarely looks like one dramatic, movie-worthy act. It's usually a collection of small, defiant choices. A poster taped to a door, a walkout, whispered conversations, a refusal to be silent. And every generation finds its own way to resist. And that brings us to today's story, because in 1942, a few students found theirs. And that's exactly what connects us back to the White Rose. So who were the White Rose? It began with a few university students in Munich, Germany in 1942. The world was already deep into World War II. Hitler had been in power for nearly a decade. Germany was a police state. Dissent was criminal. Fear was ordinary, and silence was survival. But in that silence, something began to stir. Hans Scholl was a medical student at the University of Munich, a former member of the Hitler Youth who had grown disillusioned. His younger sister Sophie had been in the League of German Girls. And like many German teenagers, they were once swept up in the promise of belonging, of patriotism. But as they grew older, the truth became undeniable. The brutality of the regime, the lies, the persecution of the Jews, the suppression of conscience. Hans began reading banned books, works by philosophers, poets, theologians banned by the Nazis. He shared them with friends Alexander Schmorell, Christoph Probst, and Willy Graf. Students who still believed in moral responsibility, in God, in the dignity of human life. And then came the words. In June of 1942, they began writing and secretly distributing leaflets, small typed pages titled Leaflets of the White Rose. And no one is quite sure why they chose the name, but scholars think it symbolized purity, moral courage, and truth in the face of corruption. Their first leaflet condemned Hitler's war and the mass murder of the Jews. It called on Germans to resist through moral awakening. And here's a passage. Isn't it true that every honest German is ashamed of his government these days? Who among us can sense this monstrous guilt that will forever be attached to our name? Think about that. Writing those words in 1942 in Nazi Germany was a death sentence. Yet they printed hundreds of copies on a small duplicating machine and mailed them through people across Munich. They wrote 6 leaflets in total, each one more urgent than the last. They quoted philosophy, scripture, and classical literature, calling on Germans to rise up for conscience and to reclaim their humanity. In one, they wrote, "We will not be silent. We are your bad conscience. The White Rose will not leave you in peace." Their tone was fierce, almost prophetic. They saw words as their weapon. And as the group grew bolder, they began traveling to other cities, Stuttgart, Frankfurt, Vienna, leaving stacks of leaflets in phone booths, in trains, and university corridors. They wanted to awaken a sleeping nation, one paper at a time. And then came February 18th, 1943. The war had turned. German cities were bombed, and at the University of Munich, classes were in session. Sophie and Hans carried a suitcase full of leaflets into the main building, and they began placing stacks outside lecture halls and on windowsills. And then, in a moment that still echoes through history, Sophie walked up to the top floor and tossed the remaining leaflets from the balcony into the atrium below. White pages fluttered down like snow. And a janitor, loyal to the Nazi party, saw them. He locked the doors and called the Gestapo, and within hours, Hans and Sophie were arrested. During interrogation, they didn't try to hide. They took responsibility. Hans even tried to protect his friends, but the Gestapo already knew more than he had realized. Within days, their friend Christoph Probst was also arrested. Their trial took place on February 22nd, 1943, before the notorious People's Court judge Roland Freisler, a man known for humiliation and rage. The trial only lasted a few hours, and when the verdict was announced, death by guillotine, Sophie reportedly said, "Such a fine, sunny day, and I have to go." But what does death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred into action? And that afternoon, just a few hours later, all three were executed. Hans was 24, Sophie 21, and Christoph 23. Their courage stunned the prison guards. One witness later said Hans's final words were simple: "Long live freedom." And that was the end of the White Rose, at least on the surface, because their words didn't die. Copies of their leaflets were smuggled out of Germany. One reached Allied forces who reprinted them by the millions and dropped them all over German cities as flyers titled "The Manifesto of the Students of Munich." And what began as a few sheets of paper in one city became a symbol across continents. And when I read about the White Rose, I always think of the ordinariness of them. Students, siblings, friends. They weren't trained activists or revolutionaries. They didn't have social media or microphones, just words, conscience, and an unshakable belief that silence was complicity. Their story isn't just about bravery, it's about moral clarity, the understanding that truth matters even when it doesn't win, even when it costs everything. They didn't live to see the world change, but they trusted that truth, once spoken, can't be unspoken. That once planted, a seed will grow somewhere even if you never get to see it bloom. And that's what I keep coming back to. The idea that resistance isn't just something from history, it's something we live. Because we may not be facing the same horrors that they did, but we are surrounded by systems built on silence, injustice, and fear. And the question becomes, what do we do with the freedoms they never had? And that's why every episode of Blooming Resistance will end with something we can all do. Small, real ways to plant seeds of courage in our time. So let's talk about what that can look like right now. Because the truth is, there are always new regimes of fear, new silences that demand breaking. And when I read Hans and Sophie Scholl's leaflets, I think about how they would recognize our world today. I think they'd see people risking their jobs, their safety, sometimes even their freedom to tell the truth. They'd see students walking out of classrooms to demand justice for Gaza. They'd see immigration activists standing outside detention centers, holding signs with names of people most of us will never know. They'd see journalists and whistleblowers digging for truth when governments would rather bury it. And they know this is what resistance looks like in our time. It's never convenient, it's rarely rewarded, but it's always necessary. We may not be distributing leaflets, but we're still fighting disinformation, still challenging propaganda, still pushing truth into the public square. And sometimes that means showing up in person, and sometimes it means refusing to share the lie online. And if you ever feel like your voice doesn't matter, remember, the White Rose had no platform, no funding, no safety net, just conviction. So what can we do now, in our time, with our own tools? So here are some seeds that you can plant this week. First, amplify courage. Share the voices of people telling the truth even when it's unpopular or inconvenient, whether it's student journalists or human rights observers or neighbors speaking out against injustice. Lift them up. The algorithms favor noise. Courage needs a microphone. Second, connect locally. If you're in the US, there are grassroots groups doing quiet, consistent work, immigrant justice networks, tenant unions, food drivers for refugee families, and local campaigns for ceasefire resolutions. Pick one. Even 1 hour of your time or one donation makes a difference. Third, challenge silence where you find it. In your workplace, in your classroom, your family group chat, when someone repeats propaganda or cruelty disguised as policy, don't let it slide. You don't have to debate. Just plant a question. Sometimes resistance begins with, but what if that's not true? And finally, remember that resistance doesn't always roar. It's the teacher who slips a banned book into a student's hands. It's the neighbor who shows up to translate for a family during an ICE raid. It's the person who refuses to scroll past another tragedy without naming it out loud. Each of those moments is a leaflet in its own right. So this week, whatever you do, let it be your leaflet. Let it carry your truth into the world. And I always want to end an episode with light, not despair. So here's a story that gives me hope. Just this week, a federal judge blocked a policy that would have sent unaccompanied immigrant children into adult ICE detention the moment they turned 18. It's easy to feel like compassion doesn't stand a chance against bureaucracy or cruelty, but this decision happened because people cared. Lawyers challenged it, advocates spoke out, and the courts listened. It's a reminder that even now resistance blooms in courtrooms, in classrooms, in community meetings, and every time someone stands up for another person's dignity, a new white rose takes root. It proves that resistance blooms even in small acts, and that courage is contagious. Today we remembered the white rose, a handful of students who believed that words could be stronger than fear. They remind us that courage doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it's just refusing to stay silent. Sometimes it's a leaflet or a lawsuit or a moment of truth that ripples further than we'll ever see. We live in a noisy world, but resistance still begins the same way it did in 1943, with a choice to speak. So this week, keep planting seeds. Speak the truth, defend the vulnerable, stay rooted in compassion, because courage, once planted, always grows, even through concrete, even in dark times. I'm Kate, and this was the first episode of Blooming Resistance. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, keep planting seeds of courage.